I am Pocho Salcedo, and I welcome our audience in Latin America and all those who join us from coast to coast here in the continental United States and Hawaii. Once again, I invite you from New York to walk beyond the headlines. Welcome to the DNA of the news. Matryoshka is a Russian wooden doll with the smaller dolls stacked inside. The larger ones, they symbolize Russian folk and art and culture. It's also an analogy to the surprises of the last 24 years of Vladimir Putin's exercise of power. Can we be more surprised by Putin's regime? Well, recently, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner mercenary group, died in a plane crash precisely 2 months after leading a riot against the Russian establishment that shook the foundations of President Vladimir Putin. We will talk about this and much more with one of the most recognized Russian experts in this part of the world and a friend of the DNA of the news. Professor Aurel Braun, welcome to the DNA of the news.
Thank you very much.
Aurel Braun is currently a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. He is also a Center Associate of the Davis Center at Harvard University. Additionally, he is a senior member of the Center for Eurasian, Russian and East European Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs, and a Fellow and Senator of Trinity College, all at the University of Toronto. In December 2012, Professor Braun was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for services to Canada and for academic distinction by the Governor-General of Canada. He is the author and/or editor of several books. His latest book is NATO-Russia Relations in the 21st Century. His forthcoming book is on Russia, the West and Arctic Security.
The strong men with centralized powers have governed Russia for centuries. They are part of the fiber of Russia, going back all the way to Ivan the Terrible in the 1500s. Why should Putin be any different?
When we look at Russian history, it's not a happy one. This is a country that has suffered more than just about any other state has in the region. And it has endured all these turmoils. So there is a temptation to always look for analogies. And there are historical roots, and that is undeniable. But at the same time, the analogies don't quite hold up, because other leaders had a larger purpose. They envisioned an empire. They envisioned modernization. They envisioned the freeing of the serfs. In the case of Vladimir Putin, the more closely we examine his rule, it is all about personal power. And everything else, nationalism, international adventures, they all serve the preservation of that personal power, personal privilege, and enrichment. He has become one of the wealthiest people around. Some estimates are that he's worth $40 billion. People around him became super wealthy. And so the analogy is much closer to that of an organized crime syndicate than just authoritarian rule. And I think if we use that metaphor, we get a better insight of how this regime operates, because everything else becomes instrumental. Nationalism, orthodoxy, autocracy are instruments to preserve that power rather than being the ultimate goal.
There were many assumptions made by President Vladimir Putin. The rationale was that Ukraine was deeply divided and would not provide a unified and adequate response, that Zelensky was weak, overrated the Russian army, and underrated the Ukrainian military, and he was really blind to the reaction of NATO countries. Regardless of the final outcome of the war, what are the long-term effects for Russia and Europe?
There is obviously tragedy in Ukraine, the horrific loss of life, civilian as well as military. But I think ultimately, this is also a disaster for Russia and it poses major problems for Europe. Identity problems for Europe. Where are they going? What is their relationship with each other? What is the relationship that they will have in the future with Russia? What is the relationship that they will have with the United States, the transatlantic relationship? So in a sense, this war pushes us to the fundamentals. It was a miscalculation, as you suggest. And many wars start as a result of miscalculations. But the fact that there was this war, which really began in 2014 and became an all-out war, since Vladimir Putin believed that this would be an easy conquest, tells us a lot about Russian domestic politics. The Russian political order lacks legitimacy. Vladimir Putin has avoided dealing with the fundamental problems, the economic problems, the issues of political legitimacy, the fact that the elections have been fraudulent. And so he has looked for foreign adventures to divert attention away. And he did that successfully in the case of Georgia in 2008, and he received a huge boost in popularity. He did that in 2014 with Ukraine, when he annexed Crimea, and that resulted in a huge boost in popularity. He got involved in Syria and propped up the Assad regime, and that increased his popularity. So this was a method to generate legitimacy through external adventures. And it's not a coincidence, I would suggest, that the invasion, all-out invasion of Ukraine was preceded inside Russia with massive repression of dissent. Because there's nothing that Vladimir Putin fears more than democracy.
Well, thank you for your comments. But what would be an honorable outcome for Russia and Ukraine to end this conflict?
The problem is that the longer a war lasts, the more the goals change. So whereas, let's say a year ago, there may have been one scenario of a possible settlement, now it becomes another one, and it's a shape-shifting kind of issue. For Russia, the original goal was the elimination of Ukraine as an independent state, the elimination of the democratically elected Zelensky government. Well, that goal is not achievable, not the way it looks right now. In the case of Ukraine, they said at the beginning that they want to retake all of the territory, but that did not seem possible. But now it may be something that could be more viable, although the movement is very slow. They're incurring a lot of losses. So for the Putin regime, the problem is that Vladimir Putin would have to rationalize away what essentially looks increasingly like a likely Russian defeat. And to his credit, he has been very good at rationalizing away all sorts of defeats. The enlargement of NATO, which he opposed. And you will recall that among the initial demands that Vladimir Putin made when he invaded all out Ukraine in 2022 was not only that the Ukrainian regime basically surrender, that Ukraine give up its sovereignty, but also that NATO should reverse its enlargement post-1997. This would have been an alliance suicide. What has happened in the interim? Not only has NATO strengthened itself, but NATO has enlarged further. The nightmare scenario in the Kremlin. Finland, a neutral state that had tried so hard to be accommodating to Russia, is now a NATO member with an 840-mile border with Russia. Sweden, for all intents and purposes, is functioning as a NATO state, has approved its parliament membership, is waiting for Turkey to sign on, and they will become a NATO member. And Vladimir Putin has rationalized that away, saying, well, we will deal with it. And so I think if he loses more territory, if he has to concede more territory, he could rationalize that away by perhaps saying, we were faced with all of NATO, the collective West. You will already see the Russian propaganda machinery talk about not merely Ukraine fighting Russia, but the collective West fighting Russia. And if you need to make concessions to the collective West, it's much easier to sell to the Russian public than being defeated by a regime that was in Russian propaganda illegitimate, by a people who are not supposed to have an identity, the Ukrainians, having to leave a territory that was claimed to be Russian. So if it is the collective West that forces Russia into major concessions, I am fairly confident that Vladimir Putin would be able to sell it. Now, from the perspective of Ukraine, that is a more interesting question. Will they settle for some kind of territorial compromise? And I think this is where NATO is so essential. Because if the alliance would like to have Ukraine settle for some kind of territorial compromise, let's say either all of Crimea or part of Crimea, they will have to offer something to Ukraine that is ironclad, not like the Budapest Memorandum. And the only ironclad guarantee that would be meaningful to Ukraine would be NATO membership. And NATO membership could lead to some kind of deal that does involve some territorial compromise. I'm not advocating that, but I can see that as the possible contours of some settlement. So it depends not only on Russia, not only on Ukraine, but also on the Western alliance.
But not too long ago, Vladimir Putin, speaking to the Russian people, equated this a fight for survival, like one of the Soviet Union battling Nazi Germany, and the West, and as you indicated, enlarged the war. And even he said, "I fight out of duty for the motherland." Our grandfathers went all the way to Berlin to ensure that there will be no enemy country next door. We won't allow America and NATO to install themselves. So in a way, making his options even more lesser options than he will normally have if he didn't enlarge the war this way.
You might say that if we were dealing with a usual leader, then this would be the proverbial painting yourself in a corner, not allowing yourself options. But you will recall he threatened the most dire, that is Vladimir Putin, threatened the most dire consequences if Finland and Sweden were to join, and he did nothing. So he has this remarkable ability to double talk, to draw imaginary red lines, and when they're crossed, rationalize away the fact that he doesn't react. So I think he would be able to do that again, because ultimately what he wants to do is stay in power. That is what it's about. Everything else is secondary. All the other steps, all the other policies that he's pursuing are instrumental to that single focus. And this is why he is somewhat different from previous rulers, because he had an opportunity. Let's not forget that when he took over as leader of Russia, there was a chance to build a successful modern state. And we talked about this, that if you look at other countries, after they lose a war or after they undergo some traumatic change, 30 years later, former Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, militaristic Japan were successful, spectacularly successful democracies and modernized economies. Putin has failed to do that.
And we have come amazingly enough to the end of our first segment. We'll be right back. We just started the discussion. We'll see you in a few seconds. And we are back with Professor Aurel Braun. He joins us from Toronto, Canada. Professor Braun, in an early discussion, we touched the China factor in all this relationship between China and Russia. And you call it at one time that Russia was becoming Asia-centric, and that was a big momentous change.
There is a push, both geopolitical as well as ideological, if you like, or at least an ideological veneer to it, that Russia is becoming more of a Eurasian state rather than a European state, that they want to focus more on the Pacific, on relations with China. And this is something that goes against 300 years of Russian history, because for the past 300 years, Russia, the Soviet Union, have been fundamentally European entities, the Tsarist Russia and Communist Russia. So this is, in a sense, grafting a new identity onto Russia, and I'm not sure if the graft will take, because even though economic relations with China have strengthened enormously, they've done so not necessarily because it is a natural evolution, but because Russia has gradually been pushed out of its relationship with the West, or has chosen to move out of the relationship with the West. In the process, it has become far more dependent on China. It is an asymmetrical relationship. And don't forget that Russia used to be a member of the G8. Now it's taking pride in enlarging, or helping to enlarge, the BRICS organization. Well, that's not the same level of engagement. It doesn't have the same kind of opportunities. But here again, you have Vladimir Putin rationalizing away the fact that by having failed to build a modern economy, by having failed to have democracy and legitimacy in Russia, his relationship with the West was bound to deteriorate.
And you just mentioned BRICS. Russia is a founding member of the BRICS group, which recently announced its expansion with the addition of 6 new countries: Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. BRICS now represents 42% of the world's population and 36% of the global GDP. The primary economic bloc was initially created as an alternative to the US-led international order, and offers countries in the global south a counterbalance to Western institutions. Your thoughts, please.
I think what you just enunciated, that it's supposed to be a counterbalance, that it represents a significant portion of the population, even a significant portion of the total GDP, depending how you count the GDP, whether you count it in nominal terms or in purchasing power parity, was larger in the latter, smaller in the former. And that is the goal. And it has been argued by some that China is the big winner in this because they have the resources. This is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and it means increasing Chinese influence. And in a sense, Russia is going along with this and is going to benefit from that. On closer examination, I don't think it's as promising as it looks, because it is an odd mixture of countries. You take at Iran, this is the world's largest supporter of terrorism. It's a pariah state, hardly a great asset. If you look at Argentina, this is a serial defaulter and is the largest debtor to the IMF. If you look at Egypt, they have enormous economic problems, and they are the second largest debtor. Ethiopia is fighting a 2-year civil war, which is extremely violent and really, really messy. So when you consider that Russia was a member of the G8, the Premier League, so to speak, this is not the same league. It is not the same capacity. It is a difficult mixture. Iran, Saudi Arabia, they're oil and water. They may have a kind of pretend larcenous relationship, but not exactly a natural one. UAE is a small state that basically has lots of money, but they may not invest it in places like Russia because Russia is not a fertile ground for foreign investments. So even if we could make a case that China is benefiting, and there's more skepticism about this, it's highly unlikely that Russia will benefit. And when you compare it to the loss of its position before, I do not see how this is compensation.
Well, thank you for your comments. And I, going back 2-3 years, when this Ukrainian-Russian issue was developing, There was a lot of discussion about that, how dependent Europe became from energy sources coming from Russia. And on September of 2022, an explosion, an anonymous attack in the middle of the Baltic Sea to the Nord Stream gas pipeline took place. That pipe connected Russia, the supplier, to Germany and the rest of Europe for natural gas. Who do you think did it, and who was most interested in that disruption? Do you have any thoughts?
We don't have a definitive answer. As you know, there are ongoing investigations, including by Sweden, and we have not seen the actual reports. What has been leaked so far is that clearly there was some kind of explosion, that this was not some natural development. It wasn't that the pipeline just somehow ruptured on its own, that this was a deliberate act. It was an act of sabotage. There are two lines. One of them was destroyed, not the other one, but this was destroyed after the flow was already stopped. So this would go to who would have the interest in it. And so the suspicion, of course, would be that Ukraine would have an interest in blowing it up because they don't want to have Russian oil flowing through this pipeline. Poland even might have an interest. The West might have an interest. And why would Russia do it? But on the other hand, one could make an argument that it may have been even in Russia's interest to emphasize to Europeans the kind of power they can wield as a result of energy pressure. Whatever the cause was in terms of motivating factors, the energy dependence on Russia has phenomenally diminished. And therefore, that pipeline's significance has dissipated tremendously. And so, whereas when we looked at the pipeline initially, the loss of that pipeline, or at least one of those big pipelines, was a major factor because so much of the natural gas that was used in Europe, 40% plus in Germany, came from Russia. That is not the case any longer.
The fact that Mr. Prigozhin survived for 2 months after staging his rebellion was more surprising than the crash of his plane. In late June of 2023, he called his uprising March for Justice. What provoked that march? Why did he think that his actions would not be unpunished if he was not successful?
Prigozhin had become a hero inside Russia. He was portrayed on social media in Russia and on the regular media as the person who has contributed tremendously to the Russian war effort. Let's not forget that he had recruited tens of thousands of convicts who played a big role together with the core of the Wagner Group, who were highly professional soldiers, in taking Bakhmut. And that was one of the victories, small, but in terms of image, significant victory. And he was very frustrated with the incompetence of the military and how this war was being fought. And the challenge that it presented, even though he argued that it wasn't against Putin personally, but it was against incompetent military leaders such as the defense minister and the chief of staff, General Gerasimov, was nonetheless a frontal assault because he said three things that were crucial. One, that this was a war, not a special military action. People would go to jail for that. Second, he said that this was an unnecessary war, that Ukraine did not present a challenge that had to go to war. And third, he said that the war was run incompetently and thousands of Russian soldiers died because of that. This was not something that Vladimir Putin could accept. And consequently, he needed to eliminate Prigozhin. But he couldn't do it. He tried at first, because you will recall that when Prigozhin and the Wagner Group went to the Rostov-on-Don, where the southern military headquarters were, he was greeted like a hero, he and the Wagner Group. When his forces moved towards Moscow, there were military units sent against him, helicopters and so on, and they were shot down by Wagner. So Vladimir Putin's military was not willing to switch to Prigozhin, which perhaps Prigozhin expected, but they were not willing to defend Vladimir Putin either. And this is why in the morning of the mutiny, Vladimir Putin said that these people were traitors committing treason. By the afternoon, he pardoned them. And 5 days later, he was having tea with Prigozhin. He had no choice immediately, but ultimately, going by the code of organized crime syndicates, he had to eliminate Prigozhin. He had to make sure that he made the mark. But by not being able to do it immediately, he showed weakness. The aura of invincibility that he had has been punctured, and that cannot be restored.
Professor Braun, you have focused on Russia. You're an expert, recognized. Is there anything that we should be looking forward, that we should be paying attention, a development that give us a clue of what is to happen?
There are always surprises, and we in the academic world often get things wrong because of the imprecision of social sciences. I think what most surprised me was the level of corruption that has permeated the Russian military. A huge amount of money was spent on the Russian military in a 10-year program, and the performance was extraordinarily poor in February of last year. And what it showed was that it was not only Russian society that under Vladimir Putin had become utterly corrupt, where corruption is corrosive, but the military itself has not escaped that, which means that every facet of Russian life now has been subject to this kind of erosion.
When was your aha moment when you said, okay, this is what I am going to pursue, and you focus on Russia?
It was during the Cold War and the threat of nuclear conflict. And that focused a lot of people's attention of how to avoid that conflict. And I came to the conclusion that the best way to avoid it was to avoid rigid ideological battles, that if the systems could change, then there was hope. And there was hope after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a great deal of hope, which sadly has in many ways evaporated.
Well, thank you very much. And it's always a pleasure to have you in the show. You're not only an expert, but you're a good friend of the DNA of the news, and we appreciate you coming and sharing your time with us.
You're very kind. Thank you.